Okay, so I was just admiring your body art because I think it looks amazing. But thank you so much for being on here with me, Jen.
Yeah, thank you, Darian, for the invitation. I appreciate it. I'm
Yeah, of
excited.
course. I mean, I have a very huge interest in psychedelics and the healing aspect of it. And it seems like, based off what I've seen of your work, that you are very much into research and actual work in this area. So let's talk about that, your interest and how you got into this.
Sure, let's. Um, yeah, so I've been a nurse for 20 years and a psychiatric nurse practitioner, so a psychiatric provider for the last six. And it wasn't planned in terms of my studies when I was working towards my master's to become a nurse practitioner in mental health care. And I stumbled into the research and clinical use of specifically ketamine when I decided to open my private practice 3 years ago. And I was seeing all the exciting data that were being published around treatment-resistant depression and ketamine. And so I started looking into some additional training to add that to my practice. And that's when I fell into the rabbit hole. Um, I came to realize that we were missing, such a unique opportunity with ketamine, which is currently the only legal psychedelic available for clinical use. There's a lot of exciting research going on with MDMA and psilocybin, and hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll have access to those medicines to help folks heal. So yeah, that's how I ended up, like I said, falling into the rabbit hole and doing some additional training, and also became the focus of my PhD, my dissertation research.
And that's amazing. I mean, that's really cool. So I think for the audience, it's good. I'd like to clarify what we're talking about a little bit. So ketamine, can you talk a little bit about what it is and the difference between ketamine and other psychedelics?
Sure, I'm happy to. So yes, there's some distinct differences. And when I speak to ketamine, I'm referring to racemic ketamine, which is the older molecule that's been around since the late 60s, FDA approved in 1970 as a dissociative anesthetic. And so it's been used across the lifespan for many, many decades, 50 plus years, and also in veterinary medicine. And it's considered an essential medicine by the World Health Organization. It's used on the battlefields because one of the unique qualities of this medicine is that it targets pain receptors. So what that means is that it helps reduce pain. It's an analgesic as well. Um, and in much higher doses than we're using in mental health care, and even psychedelic dosages, it's used in the hospital to date as an anesthetic. And so for mental health care, we're using sub-anesthetic dosages in practice. And another distinction with ketamine as a psychedelic is that most other medicines that are being researched and plant medicines that have been around, time memoriam, from what we understand, are predominantly serotonergic. And we call those classic psychedelics. And those are things like LSD, psilocybin, which is the psychoactive component of particular species of fungus, of mushrooms, MDMA, also called ecstasy, is serotonergic, ayahuasca, again, serotonergic. So ketamine, in addition to targeting opioid receptors, targets glutamate. And glutamate's a different neurotransmitter, one of the most abundant actually in our brains. And yet we have very few medicines that work with those receptors with glutamate. So it's glutamatergic. And that's important because we think, well, for one, for folks who aren't responding or haven't done well with, what's available, current medications and treatments, they may be responding because of the unique mechanism of action, the glutamatergic effects of ketamine. And the other nice thing about this, because we're not really sure yet, many of the psychotropics or prescription medicines in mental health care are also serotonergic. And there's a lot of research going on right now around safety of, classic psychedelics with concurrent psychotropic, things like Prozac and SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And we don't yet know, how safe it is to combine those with classic psychedelics. With ketamine, we don't have to worry about potential interactions. So for folks that are some in desperate need of relief from their suffering, from suicidality and chronic and or complex PTSD, they don't have to discontinue don't have to alter most of the medicines that are available. So those are just a couple of things that I think make ketamine unique.
I mean, clearly you've talked about this before. That was very well laid out, like a true researcher.
I had my nerd cap on.
You had it on, and that was amazing. Well, I just think it's important we understand what we're dealing with. A lot of times we talk about things, but we kind of fly over it. And I think for the audience, especially anybody who's very curious, give them the full report so they understand all of the jargon, the language, so they get a full picture.
Absolutely. And we really want to, harm reduction is very important, and with these molecules, with psychedelics. And so I think it's important that, consumers are informed,
Yes.
not only with, clinical use, but also with, the decriminalization movement that we're seeing.
That's right.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about, you mentioned you went down the rabbit hole, right? A lot of people go down rabbit holes and could get weird.
Yes.
What was your experience going down this rabbit hole, like your feelings about it as you were diving deeper?
Excitement. The prevailing model with ketamine administration it's very Western, medicalized. So what a lot of folks don't realize is, including, unfortunately, clinicians, because a lot of these IV infusion clinics are being run by folks who are not in mental health care. So their disciplines are, for example, anesthesiology or pain management or emergency medicine. And so it's being treated in a way that's very medicalized. There's no preparation for the experience. The set and setting or the ecosystem around the experience is not being addressed. And nor is integrating the experiences that can arise during ketamine administration, regardless of route of administration. And so I was excited because most of the research was strictly based on medication, very biomedical, right? Like, here's the physiology, here's the dosage, the protocols, nothing qualitative about the experiences. So it was still positive, right? The outcomes were still, being reported as robust and positive, especially with treatment-resistant depression. But when I realized that this is something that's available, already for clinical use, and that it's being offered for, mental health care, and yet not being mental health, is not really being addressed in how it's being administered and offered. Again, I thought, wow, what a missed opportunity for these folks. And I'm curious too about duration of the improvements and the extent of, shifts in perspective, and including existential, right?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
What have you noticed in your work maybe some resistance to this field of research, or people's attitudes and behaviors that may have been based off of old ideology and things. What have you run up against with this?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting, a couple of different things. So, one within, of course, the Western, the allopathic, field of psychiatry, mental health care. And our tendency, there was a divide. Really, I think it started kind of like maybe in the 70s into the 80s with the advent of tricyclics, and then selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. There was this divergence in mental health care from really incorporating psychotherapy and work to grow and resource and skills, resilience around distress, and essentially that divergence has resulted in two camps. And again, this is continued, this has persisted, right? We have the camp of the medicine's the thing, right? Whether it's psychotropics, or psychotherapy is the thing. Even though we have decades of data, actually that report the most robust outcomes when we combine both the medication and psychotherapy, like
interesting,
to the degree of double 70% improvement.
Wow.
Yes, monotherapy in whether it's psychotherapy or psychotropics. So there's data supporting this, and yet here we are, with these IV infusion clinics. And I think, unfortunately, what a lot of clinicians have seen is a revenue opportunity, and maybe putting that ahead of, okay, what's really best for our patients, our clients, because it's an expense. It's much less expensive to have one tech or one nurse who's monitoring multiple people being infused with the medicine than it is to have individual psychotherapeutic support by a mental health care provider and probably a medical, like a nurse. So some of the resistance, I think, is related to this very allopathic reductionist approach. Like, again, the medicine's the thing, right? And so, but one of the reasons that I'm research is so important to me is because legitimizing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, for one, like this field and this approach, but in many ways it's just affirming what we've already researched with other medicines, right? There's some complexities, like I think with psychedelics also what's unique across the board is the spiritual component.
Completely.
And, we've really ignored that in Western medicine. And a lot of Western clinician, providers cringe when they hear that I say the S word, spirituality, the E word, existential, right?
This is a very huge part of this aspect that I think is an awakening of this medicine, of this treatment. I've known so many people who are very resistant to spirituality, but once they've had a guided trip, they were very much less resistant to it. And I think the experience, it almost breaks that down in you. It takes over you. It's hard to resist that.
And it's going to be hard to ignore that.
It's hard to ignore because it's like an idea that builds in your brain that never goes away. And that part, I think, is very interesting. Why do you think, though, like that is so controversial to our Western ideas and clinicians and different companies?
Well, I think for several reasons. One, how do we measure that?
Why
right?
does it always have to be about that all the time?
That's the biomedical model,
Yeah.
right? That's, and I'm not saying I agree with it. That's,
Yeah.
but that is, that's quantitative research, right?
Sure.
It's as much as we can account for confounding factors, and that's challenging. And mental health research, there's a lot, right? We're complex, our lives are complex,
Right.
um, our psyche and our belief systems, right? So it's challenging. So I think some of it is because it's hard, and it's not tangible, right? Um, and I think a lot of it is, I think, even projection, um, maybe around people's own, maybe lack of spirituality,
Yeah.
or, and again, not a criticism, right? Just a matter
Sure.
of fact,
Yeah.
there's definitely a spiritual void in our culture. And a lot of people understandably have been turned off by organized religion.
Sure.
um, but here's the thing that, as I was saying, like, we can't ignore this with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy
No
or
way.
psychedelic experiences. Like, we can't gloss over that in research anymore and pretend that it's like, oh, it's not a factor, it's not a variable that needs to be addressed, assessed, which I think, we can do that through mixed methods. So, like,
Mm.
really, qualifying the subjective experience and describing that in addition to of course, the psychometrics.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously like a lot of people are learning through different documentaries and things coming out, but certainly there was a tremendous amount of research in psychedelics before it was banned
Mm-hmm.
a national level. And some of the most profound research was from divinity students
Mm-hmm.
and how it was some of the greatest spiritual experiences that they had. But
Yes.
we tend to like push that away. Like
Mm-hmm.
that is not real research. This is quasi research. This is qualitative, all these emerging themes and stuff. But the world seems very plugged into this idea. We keep pushing it down, you know.
Yes. I mean, I think that, again, I think we're on the precipice. I think as more of these medicines become, clinically available,
Yeah,
that, as you said, and people have the experiences, and we all have bias, right? We all
that's
have
right.
bias. I'm no exception. But boy, when you have an experience, right, that's a different kind of knowing than theory, or hearing your buddy talk about,
It's a different type of knowing, that's for sure.
yes, yes. And I think important, and again, this is in my opinion, and this is taboo in a lot of, still, most of Western medicine, that I'm curious, if more of the clinicians, like in these IV infusion clinics, had experiences with the medicine, with ketamine,
Mm,
if they would continue to offer it in the way that they do, and I have theories, right?
yeah.
I have theories around that.
So you think a lot of people offering in these clinics, or maybe just some people, are not actually participants in the practice?
Correct. Right. I think a lot of providers offering ketamine, racemic ketamine, have never received it.
That
Yeah.
seems wild to me, honestly. I don't know.
Yeah. But
But
that's, again, that's like, there are many who probably will listen to this and think, oh my gosh, that's a terrible idea. Um, and again, it's like, that's why I prefaced with, this is still taboo in many circles.
yeah,
But I'm of the mind that, when we're inducing a non-ordinary state in a human, especially vulnerable population, which mental health care patients are, I think we need to be very familiar and have a relationship of some sort, a familiarity with the medicine that we're giving. But
well, it's
I'm in the minority.
yeah, really.
Oh
Okay,
yeah.
I gotta talk about that. I definitely want to talk about that, but it's interesting because this is such a profound experience on so many levels. I don't know how you explain it to someone without having gone down the rabbit hole because
Mhm.
it's like you can't explain it. Like even when you do it, it's hard to explain. Like
Right. It's
it's
ineffable.
shocking.
Yeah,
Like
it's hard to put into words, right?
yeah.
ineffability factor that's a part of psychedelic
That's
experiences.
exactly right. So this minority, I didn't realize this was a minority. Like, what is the
Yeah.
why? Like,
So yeah, fear. People, there are clinicians that have been litigated by their boards for having experiential learning.
mm,
Yep.
yeah,
There's a big push. Canada's been ahead of the curve for many years, and they're
yeah,
really pushing to allow for access for clinicians to have experiential learning with psilocybin. Um, I think MAPS has been doing the same, with MDMA.
right.
I'm absolutely a proponent of, doing that with racemic ketamine as well. So,
Wow, that's interesting.
yeah, it is. And I mean, there have been clinicians, therapists, nurses that have been, um, yeah, their boards they've been litigated, and some of whom have lost their licenses.
That's crazy. Yet they're probably having wine regularly, hanging out. It's like it's so hypocritical to me. It's crazy.
Yeah. And that too, I think, is why that, separate, kind of a separate topic, but definitely overlap. The
Yeah.
decriminalization movement is an important part of this. Like, we really need to take the criminality out of,
Yes.
again, this is my opinion.
Yeah. It's my
um,
opinion too.
right. I mean, on multi, like, social levels,
Yeah.
but also, like, for this field, and for folks to have these opportunities without fear of
Yeah.
being reprimanded, in our punitive system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you see like the legitimization of this movement? Like, so I think for a lot of people, I just talk to a lot of people. That's how I learn a lot of stuff too, I think a lot of people mention Michael Pollan as a kind of a legitimizing source
Mhm.
with How to Change Your Mind, the book and the whole thing. How do you think this becomes more legitimate? Is it through people like a Michael Pollan who have a larger following? Is it through the research? What's the best avenue to continue to move this in a positive direction?
It's a great question, and another, like, hot topic.
Yeah,
How can we destigmatize? And it's complex, right? Because we have lots of different ways in which these, molecules, I'll call them, right?
right.
I have a tendency to call them medicines for different reasons, but
Mm-hmm.
are being used from recreationally, right? To people going to other countries where these, are sacred, plant teachers. That's that is the belief and the approach and perspective. Um, and then we have, folks who are, wanting and excited about using these medicines clinically. So, how do we move this forward? It's complex, right? Because they're being used and have been, again, time memoriam, since time, um, since we were able to ingest, who knows when,
Right,
um, fungus and other plants. Um, I think in the healthcare arena, I think we legitimize it through research. The problem, though, and we've kind of alluded to this, like, what's the resistance, and we talked about, some of the, like, the existentialism, right? That's part of this. Um, but the gold standard is blinded, randomized control trial.
right, right.
And I mean, you can't help but to kind of chuckle a little bit when we think about that. So, like, am I getting a placebo, or am I having, like, an 8-hour psychedelic experience? I don't know, right?
Yeah,
And so, this is, we legitimize it. I still believe through research, including the, spiritual existential experience that, research participants, and I would say clinical research as well, that patients have. Um, but in like the healthcare, that healing arena, we probably need to consider more of comparison studies versus, like, trying to do a double blind randomized control trial.
right.
What I mean by that is, certainly going through an IRB, making sure that it's being done ethically and, correct,
Sure.
right, with protocols. Um, but comparing some of these medicines, in research versus, like, trying to come up with, a way to have a placebo, that's very challenging.
Yeah. What are the
Um,
ethics behind? I think of the ethics behind that on some level of like not giving someone this molecule of medicine. They don't get it, but maybe they really need it, you know?
yeah, and so we can have a design that includes like post-study conclusion that
Mm,
everybody gets
right,
the
right.
psychoactive or the medicine that's being investigated.
Yeah,
That can be a stipulation so that nobody is like as you're saying, like
yeah.
ethically and um, being denied access. So we can do that, and studies, research projects. I think many of them probably do.
Right. On another level, how important are the messengers of this? What role are the specific messengers of this message going to be? It's like in my industry in fitness, we're dealing with so much with a message problem and the messengers of
Yes.
it. And I wonder how that translates into this area is who are the messengers and how important is the message on a large public scale versus just the research internal review board scale?
Right. Yeah, this is a great question and another hot topic, right? Because if we look at, you know, who has access to the medicines, who's being included in research, well, they're people that look like me, you know,
Right.
predominantly men, running the studies, still, but in terms of access, so I think part of this very much is cultural, regarding who are the messengers. And when I say cultural, I mean, again, across like many layers,
Right.
right? Not just race and gender, sexual, identity and orientation. But, you know, the other thing is, who's offering it, predominantly, right? What's available, ketamine is,
Mm-hmm.
well, people who look like me. And, you know, we're working already with the vulnerable population who, many of whom are reticent, if they even have access to mental health care, are reticent to trust, clinicians. But we need more varied clinicians offering these. And so I think so, in terms of who are the messengers, well, certainly, clinicians, right? Um, but again, that's a very limited
Right.
demographic.
Exactly.
And then, and then we have gender, and there's some great people doing some really, really great work, including documentaries, really about inclusivity, trying to take some of this information to the streets so that, more people with, non-white skin are, learning and being exposed to it. And I think understandably that a lot of people, there's a mistrust, of our healthcare system, and certainly a mistrust of, people who look like me in our healthcare system. And again, for like legitimate
Right.
reasons, right? Um, Both research and, unfortunately, and the quality of care that they've had access to. So I think the messengers are not, I think it's important, across many layers of, again, culture. So non-clinicians, healers, spiritual leaders.
Right. That's a
Uh,
big one, actually.
yeah,
That would be amazing to have spiritual leaders or religious leaders who will come out in support of these molecules, medicine, because
yeah.
it would be so counterintuitive for a lot of people. But, certain people have a lot of sway and it may actually cause a wave of support
Mhm.
or negativity for some people. But I think that has not been talked about enough.
No, and I know, I mean, I'm originally from the Southeast, and I know that there are many a sermon on Sundays that are, really discouraging their congregation from even using like serotonergic, like
Right.
psychotropics, like SSRIs, like
Hmm.
prayer, is
Right.
the answer. And I'm not minimizing that as as helpful. I think faith can be
Sure.
very
Of
helpful.
course. Of
Um,
course.
but I also, like you're saying, uh, we have a long way to go in that arena, right?
Yes, that's the messenger thing. I think part of it is like, who is telling this? Is this for me personally? Like, I want to platform as many people in this space to get the word out about all different avenues related to this. So it
Mhm.
makes me think, what do you feel your responsibility is and other people in your space for doing things like this
Mhm.
and writing about it? What's the responsibility, you think?
I think it is. I feel responsible as much as I can be. I mean,
Yeah.
not, personally, but as, as a scientist, as a provider. So one of the things that I do, so I train clinicians now. I have a 4-day experiential CAP training for licensed clinicians, and I offer scholarships for underrepresented clinicians. And so since the beginning of this year, 2022, every month I've had, and when I say underrepresented, um, you know, not just minority, but also LGBTQIA plus
Right.
folks as well. So I've had, and my trainings are small. So of at most 8 participants, one since January has been able to attend gratis at no cost, other than like travel and
Right.
accommodation, the training. I feel like in a small micro way, that's one way that I'm trying to expand access, to different demographics, to more people. Other things that I've done in the community are talks, again, gratis, for different, like for our local psychedelic association. And there's a lot of these now in cities.
Yes, there are. Yeah.
So we have one here in Tucson, Tucson Psychedelic Society. And so before the pandemic, I did a talk. Um, so I was excited. I look at, opportunities to do podcasts and speak, as much as I can. Um, I think also these, folks that I come into contact with that feel siloed. And I can tell you that even being, Caucasian, being white, I feel siloed in this field because it is still quite taboo, as we talked about. But in terms of more representation and expanded access to people of different, ethnicities, getting, plugging people in, networking people in, I think is another way that, um, I can, be of service in that way. But again, it is much more of the clinical side. I
Yeah.
think it is important to have people like lay people like Michael Pollan, especially non-white, people,
Right.
um, sharing and talking about their experiences with their church community, with their neighborhood community, with their family members, to
Yeah.
help destigmatize and just raise awareness that there are some additional options that, and it is true that most of what we have for about 40% of folks, who actually seek mental health care, just they're not efficacious, they're not effective.
No, not
So
at all. I think is one of the things too is often a substance or molecule, whatever, is deemed a certain thing. And then it is also deemed that the person doing this is a certain type of person.
mm,
And so this is a person lurking in an alley, in a corner. They're a loser, right? And this has been the
yeah.
case with psychedelics for a long time. So
Hmm.
I always feel the responsibility as a layperson in this field is like, listen, I have success in another field. I have a lot of education. I'm not going to be afraid to put this out there to other people. And which the amazing thing is like me talking about has opened up a huge wall, taken down a huge wall to so many people I know. They're like, he's into this? Wait a minute. And that's the responsibility part, I think, because if it's just coming from someone who other people believe is like they're doing nothing,
Hmm.
like stereotypical thing,
Hmm.
the message falls flatter versus if it starts coming from people you're like, wait a minute, I know you. You're someone who does like, you're responsible.
Hmm.
You take care. Wait a minute. If you're thinking about it, maybe I should think about it. I
Yeah.
feel a heavy responsibility towards that.
I do as well. but I understand the mistrust. I mean,
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yeah, historically, I completely understand it. Another way that, in terms of, I think the responsibility piece of, I've partnered with a colleague, and, we've been offering ketamine assisted psychotherapy gratis to Native peoples in Arizona. So again, at no cost to them, and really honoring their beliefs.
That's great.
And because that's the other piece with this work is we can no longer ignore the existential and spiritual piece, but we also need to take into account culture, and that of course is inclusive of spiritual practice, right? And not make assumptions that just because, for example, somebody may be Native or Indigenous, that they're not Christian or
Right.
Jewish,
Right.
right? That's another sort of interesting,
True.
right? Interesting thing to consider. But we want to be mindful of that for sure. So, yeah, I definitely, like you, I do. I feel responsible, and um, hopefully more and more people will have access and can have experiences that they, again, that they share with their community.
You've brought up several things that I'm like, I have not thought about this. That's the beauty of this, of chatting. Like, I think people have a certain idea about indigenous people and their spiritual nature. I mean, just think about it. I mean, for a lot of people, they haven't spent any time with indigenous people, and their ideas about their spirituality probably come from a horrible movie about it, or some
Mm-hmm.
horribly misrepresented media related to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just fascinating to hear that.
Yes. And so important, because like we were saying, we can't skirt around spirituality anymore
Yeah.
with these approaches and with these medicines, as they are being more normalized and legitimized and
Yeah.
used also in clinical settings. We really need to be honoring, leaving our agendas at the door,
Yeah.
and honoring, you know having that enough awareness that we are assessing and asking the right questions, so that we have an idea about a person's individuality,
Right. Is
right?
there a fear, you think, of some clinicians that if they honored the spirituality or the existentialism of a person doing this, and they did it over and over again with this person, that they feel that they may be pulled into that, and that they may be like, I don't want to become spiritual, but it's hard not to if you're constantly around that. Maybe there's a fear of like being involved in that.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of deep rooted feelings around spirituality,
Right.
right? Not just from trauma, but again, how each of us has been influenced by our own communities and culture.
Sure.
I think that we're talking about something that is foreign for most clinicians, not necessarily the idea of spiritual practice or using verbiage around spirituality or religion, but incorporating it into practice. And so
Yes.
something new, a change, I think that there's always resistance, right? That's human nature. But I can tell you, I mean, as an educator, right? As a somebody who's educating clinicians, I can just see the tensing when
It's
I
tight. They're getting tight.
yes, exactly, like and
We
the
can't
deer,
talk about this.
right, right, like, ooh, the S word. So yeah, there's a lot of resistance around it, but we have to remember that as clinicians, this isn't about us.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's not about us. And if we're letting our resistance and our fear, you know, influence somebody's potentially very healing spiritual, at least, in part experience, um, that's pretty, I'm hesitant to use the word, but I mean, pretty self-serving, or
Yeah.
staying in our comfort zone around this is kind of selfish.
Yeah. I think there's also too a misconception that scientists in general are pretty much like non-spiritual.
Hmm.
But actually the statistics don't bear that out if you really look deeper into it. But I think there's just pervasive theme that these are more atheistic, non-spiritual people. And I think a lot of people, like anything, they just fall into the wave of it. And it's like, I'm not into this. I don't believe in this. But the
Hmm.
closer you are to anything, and the closer you get to something, it does something to you.
Right.
And especially this is unlike any other thing.
You're
It's one
right.
thing to, be inebriated, you know, there's another thing to go down a tremendous, like, grab your soul experience. Like the last trip I had was like 9 hours. I mean, what does that? I mean, like, and then you never feel like you're not going to be out of it. You're like, is this it for me? And like, am I never going to be like, I'm never
Totally.
getting out of this, and like just the overwhelming vulnerability and emotions related to it is also just the incredible feeling. This wave of feeling who you are as a human, finally,
Yeah.
is so breathtaking. That's what I want for people as well.
Yes. I mean, it's with ketamine, it has a dissociative effect, which
Mm,
a lot of people have a negative,
right.
connotation around
That's
that.
right.
And, again, I don't want to, you know, get too off topic, but to your point about these experiences, when we have these profound experiences of being non-physical,
Yeah.
so this disconnect between mind and body, it doesn't mean that it's bothersome or that it's even like problematic. I would say that the opposite is true, that having these expansive non-physical experiences remind us that we are more than these meat suits, that we are energetic
Right.
beings having a human experience. And
Most definitely.
I mean, people are gonna, like, I know, right? Like, ooh, the resistance, when they hear
There's
me
a
say
control issue there. Most people that I've spoken to who will remain anonymous, I would never put them out there, but there's a control. Like they want to have complete control of their experience.
it.
I'm like, well, you have to like let go. Like,
Yeah,
like you cannot
that
fight it.
it's going to be very distressing,
Yes,
and that
for sure.
that's really what this also, for a lot of folks that come see me, and practice. I'll say to them, this is really, we're practicing over and over the art of surrender.
So that's right.
And that, right, that's the opposite of control. And that for most of us is like, it can be, there's resistance to varying degrees,
That's
some
right.
like, saying much more than others. But control is a defensive. That's a coping and survival mechanism, or as I say, the delusion of control.
Mm.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
Control is a defensive. I don't think I've heard it put that way.
Yes. So
Mm.
yeah, the idea, that there's parts of our mind, our egos, that believe that we have control over day to day,
Yeah.
well, everything. And the reality is that we have control over very little, right? Um, Other than our own actions and reactions. And even then, not always, right?
Right.
So outside of that, the truth is we have no control. But yeah, it is for, especially around trauma. Um, yeah, and that's the tension. That's, where anxiety arises, is when we feel like a sense of being not in control, or, our you know, um, day to day, or, something out of the ordinary is being challenged. We experience anxiety. And so our controller parts they get up in arms.
Yeah.
And yeah,
How
yeah.
was as we wrap up here, how has this changed you personally in your research and your work?
Well, I mean, I think it's been life changing, personally. Um, one of the things that I opted to do was go through a year-long ministry ordainment training, and so, not affiliated with any religion. Um, but I felt like that was something I felt like I needed to, really work my own spiritual practice muscle, so to speak.
Yeah.
And and feel more comfortable, you know, bringing the spiritual component, the spirituality component to my clinical practice. So in that, it's also changed me as a clinician, as a, you know, as a provider. So I would say, you know, doing this work over the last several years is, you know, has changed my life profoundly, both professionally and personally, in ways I just couldn't imagine. You know, has it been easy? No. I mean, as you said, like, and that's why it's important that folks have, you know, psychotherapeutic support that's ongoing after as well. The integration afterwards is as important as what happens in the experience.
Most definitely.
So, but you know, I think that it's humbling. You know, I think that these molecules keep us, you know, humble, and that's important in this work. And two, that it's a shift from the disease driven, you know, medication or symptom management model to a healing and well-being model. And so that's been a shift for me as well, in my practice.
Yeah. I totally feel all this you're saying. I feel like for me, like I feel my ego rising if I haven't really combined kind of my faith practice and um psychedelic use. If I
Mhm.
haven't done like really mix those and really push that, I feel my ego trying to control everything all the
Mhm.
time. Then when I go back under, when I take this incredible adventure, I feel myself becoming more humble and being the person I actually want to be on a regular basis.
Yeah.
That's an endearing thing. I want people to understand. It's like you think you have the world by everything. Like you just don't. Like you need to realize the significance of self. You know, like
Yes. And it's not who we think we
it's
are,
not, it's never who you think. It's definitely
right?
not. Oh,
Yes.
it's definitely not. Like
Yeah. And it's not always easy. So I think, you know,
no.
one other parting thought I just want to share, you know, I think that these are helpful tools clinically,
Yes.
including ketamine, um, you know, but it can be dysregulating. And that's why, again, having support
Yep.
is very important, you know, because, you know, we're inviting things that have maybe been repressed or suppressed,
Mhm.
right? That we've been tucking away, compartmentalizing.
Yep.
And, you know, we're opening sometimes the floodgates. And it's not to say that, you know, the healing is sometimes going through these emotive experiences afterwards and maybe during,
Yeah.
uh, that, um, you know, and that's not always easy. It's life changing, transformative, but not easy, right?
That's such a good point. I mean, it's you can say that almost about any worthwhile thing you're doing.
Yeah.
Often something that's so good for you doesn't magically make everything great. It often requires even more work. And I think that's especially indicative of faith
Mhm.
and doing these molecules. It doesn't make your life just like, oh, I'm good now. Now I'm just such a good person. It's like
Right.
now you have to really integrate this in your life and work hard to learn the lessons
Yes,
and to build those lessons in a daily practice.
exactly. 100% agree, Darian. 100%. You know, it's, you know, it really, the onus is on us. And it's like we're being shown and provided with an experience, and then we go to work. How do, you
Right.
know, it lets us know, okay, this is where the work is. And it can be blissful, it can be
Mhm.
challenging, but it's informative. And what do we do then? What is the action, you know,
Yeah.
step to to change how we're in relationship, how we're, you know, how we are as a human being, how we
Yeah.
are community.
Most definitely. Jen, I mean, I knew this was going to be great, but it was like even way better than I thought it was going to be. Like, you
Oh,
are amazing. You are a great facilitator of this information. I want to make sure people know you and everything you do. It's so important. Please tell everyone how they can connect with you.
well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I feel the same about you, Darian,
Thank
and
you.
what you're doing in this platform. Um, so yes, In terms of reaching out, certainly via email, J Montjoy. So my first initial last name at Arizona KAP.com is my email. The trainings are offered through our nonprofit, which is TRIPP Arizona. So it's a 501c3 public service organization. And then my practice is resilience. And so if you Google Resilience Tucson, you'll get, or resiliencetucson.com is the practice. We have a location, a satellite in Mesa, which is outside of Phoenix as well.
Wonderful. I mean, just well done. I mean, literally, like, I am so grateful that I know you now, literally. The work you're doing is important. I want to validate that. And I want to be encouraging and supportive here on out about everything you're doing. And it's so important. You are important. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And you're welcome.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Jen Montjoy.